My mother made me believe I was adopted for 20 years, but I discovered through medical documents that she suffered from postpartum psychosis and truly believed I had been switched at the hospital. My mother was sitting in the red velvet armchair in the living room when she calmly announced that I wasn't her biological daughter, the words leaving her mouth as naturally as commenting on the weather, while I, at 17, felt the entire world collapse around me in an avalanche of confusion and despair that would transform the next 20 years of my life into an obsessive search for a truth that should never have been questioned. It was a seemingly ordinary Sunday afternoon in March. The sunlight filtered through lace curtains, creating geometric patterns on the Persian rug my grandfather had brought from a trip, and the aroma of the orange cake she had baked earlier still lingered in the air, contrasting grotesquely with the emotional devastation her words caused while I remained paralyzed on the sofa, holding a teacup that trembled violently in my hands. Regina, my mother at 40, 2 years old at the time, maintained a strangely serene expression while observing my reaction with those blue eyes that always seemed to evaluate and judge my every movement, every breath, every tear that now streamed down my face without my being able to control it. The revelation hadn't come out of nowhere like lightning from a clear sky, but rather as the cruel climax of an argument about my school grades that she considered insufficient for someone who should be grateful for the opportunity to have been taken in by such a generous and prestigious family as ours. Throughout my childhood and early adolescence, Regina had planted small seeds of doubt about my place in that family through comments that seemed innocent but were surgically calculated to undermine my self-esteem and sense of belonging. Observations about how I hadn't inherited the natural elegance of the family's women, how my explosive temperament contrasted with the composure that characterized the true clan members, how my wavy brown hair completely clashed with the straight blonde hair that dominated the family photographs scattered throughout the house. Each comment was a subtle but persistent needle prick that gradually built a narrative of inadequacy and difference that culminated that devastating afternoon when she finally decided to reveal what she presented as the truth about my origins. The silence that followed her declaration was so dense and oppressive, it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, transforming every attempt to breathe into a battle against the sensation of emotional drowning that took over my entire body. My hands trembled so much that I ended up dropping the Chinese porcelain cup on the floor, the sound of the china shattering against the imported marble floor echoing through the house like a perfect metaphor for how I felt at that moment, broken into 1,000 pieces impossible to reconstruct. Regina didn't move to help clean up the shards, just continued observing me with that neutral and distant expression she used when she wanted to demonstrate emotional superiority. As if my dramatic reaction only confirmed her theories about my fundamental inadequacy to be part of that family. The spilled tea formed a dark puddle that slowly spread across the white floor, and I fixed my gaze on that growing stain because it was easier than facing the eyes of the woman who had just destroyed everything I thought I knew about my identity. My 37 years of life had been marked by a constant and desperate search for approval and belonging that never seemed sufficient to satisfy the impossible standards Regina established, always moving the finish line a little further whenever I approached achieving it. During 2 decades after that devastating revelation, I lived a fragmented existence between the Helena who desperately tried to prove her worth to a family that supposedly wasn't biologically mine, and the Helena who secretly searched for her biological parents in every unfamiliar face on the street, in every similar surname in phone books, in every adoption story I found in online support groups where people like me shared their journeys of discovery and reconciliation. The doubt about my origins became an open wound that never completely healed, always ready to bleed again at the slightest sign of rejection or criticism, transforming every family interaction into proof that I really didn't belong to that place, to those people, to that life that had been built on a fundamental lie. During the years that followed that fateful afternoon, I developed an unhealthy obsession with finding any evidence that would confirm or deny Regina's story about my supposed adoption. I searched through locked drawers when she left the house, looked for documents in dusty boxes in the attic during sleepless nights, interrogated distant relatives at family gatherings trying to extract any information that could clarify the mystery of my origins. Each fruitless search only intensified my anguish and fueled increasingly elaborate theories about how and why my adoption documents had been so meticulously hidden or destroyed. Regina observed my frantic search with barely disguised satisfaction, occasionally leaving false clues that led me to increasingly devastating emotional dead ends. An old photograph of an unknown woman strategically forgotten on the table, a casual comment about an orphanage that had closed decades ago, an observation about how certain physical characteristics definitely didn't come from the paternal side of the family. The family dynamic progressively deteriorated after the revelation, transforming every family dinner into an emotional minefield where any word could detonate explosions of accusations, tears, and icy silences that lasted for days. Marcos, my father, maintained a cowardly neutral stance that only confirmed my suspicions that he was also part of the conspiracy of silence about my true origins. When I confronted him directly about the adoption issue, he would look away and murmur something about past matters that should remain buried, or about how Regina knew what was best for the family, demonstrating a passivity that enraged me even more than my mother's active manipulations. His refusal to definitively confirm or deny the story only fueled my growing paranoia that my entire life had been an elaborate performance where I was the only one who didn't know the true script. The psychological impact of living with this fundamental uncertainty about my identity manifested in all areas of my adult life, sabotaging romantic relationships with pathological jealousy and chronic insecurity, damaging friendships with constant need for validation and fear of abandonment, and especially creating an insurmountable barrier between me and any form of inner peace or genuine self-acceptance. Romantic partners would drift away frustrated with my inability to fully trust or believe I was worthy of unconditional love. Friends would tire of my recurring existential crises about belonging and identity, and coworkers didn't understand why I worked obsessively to prove my worth as if my survival depended on it. Every personal or professional failure was interpreted through the distorted lens of my supposed condition as an unwanted adoptee, confirming the toxic narrative Regina had implanted in my psyche that I would never be good enough because I wasn't truly part of the family. The therapy sessions I began at 25 became the only safe space where I could explore the emotional devastation caused by the revelation without being judged or manipulated. Although even there, Regina's shadow loomed over every attempt at healing. Dr. Laura, an experienced therapist specializing in family trauma and psychological manipulation, spent years patiently helping me deconstruct the layers of mental conditioning that had been methodically built during decades of emotional abuse disguised as maternal concern. During our weekly sessions that extended for more than a decade, we explored how the revelation about the supposed adoption had been weaponized as a control tool, designed specifically to keep me in a perpetual state of insecurity and emotional dependence. Laura frequently pointed out patterns of narcissistic and sadistic behavior in Regina that went far beyond a simply difficult mother, suggesting a deeper personality disorder that transformed motherhood into a theater of psychological cruelty. The obsession with discovering the truth about my origins led me to hire a private investigator at 32, using savings I had accumulated over years specifically for that purpose. The investigator, a retired ex-police officer with experience in missing persons cases and family reunification, spent months tracking hospital records, birth certificates, adoption documents, and any paper that could confirm or refute the story that had destroyed my peace of mind for more than a decade. Each monthly report he delivered without conclusive results only intensified my frustration and fueled increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories about how far Regina had gone to hide evidence of my true identity. The investigator frequently expressed surprise at the complete absence of any documentary trail of adoption, noting that even illegal or irregular adoptions usually left some kind of bureaucratic evidence that could be traced with sufficiently thorough investigation. During this period of intensive investigation, I began questioning older family members who might have witnessed my birth or early years of life. Isabel, my father's sister, initially reluctant to get involved in what she called Regina's unnecessary dramas, eventually gave in to my desperate pleas and shared memories that completely contradicted the adoption narrative. She described in vivid detail the day of my birth at the hospital, how she had held my tiny hand while Regina recovered from a difficult labor that had lasted almost 20 hours, how my father had cried with emotion when holding me for the first time, how the entire family had gathered at the maternity ward to celebrate the arrival of the first granddaughter. Her revelations should have brought relief and clarity, but instead they only deepened my confusion and anger, because they meant Regina had deliberately lied about something as fundamental as my biological origin, with the sole purpose of psychologically torturing me. The confrontation with this contradictory evidence threw me into an even deeper spiral of questioning about Regina's motivations for creating this elaborate fiction about adoption. During a particularly explosive argument at her 60th birthday party, when alcohol had lowered her usual defenses and increased my courage for confrontation, she finally let slip fragments of the truth behind her cruel manipulations. Between screams and mutual accusations that made the other guests flee the room in embarrassment, Regina revealed that the lie about adoption had been her distorted way of preparing me for the harshness of the world, of making me stronger through suffering, of ensuring I would never become spoiled and weak like other privileged children. Her perverse logic transformed psychological abuse into educational method, cruelty into tough love, and systematic destruction of my self-esteem into preparation for the challenges of adult life. The revelation that all my existential anguish had been based on a calculated lie was simultaneously liberating and devastating in ways I could never have anticipated. On one hand, the confirmation that I was indeed Regina and Marcos's biological daughter should have brought the belonging I had desperately sought for 2 decades. But on the other hand, understanding that my own mother had deliberately chosen to torture me with this lie for years transformed any possibility of family reconciliation into an impossible fantasy. The psychological damage caused by living with this fabricated uncertainty about my identity had created wounds so deep that even the truth couldn't completely heal them, leaving emotional scars that would continue influencing every aspect of my life even after the revelation. The discovery transformed my search for identity into an even more complex battle, because now I needed to reconcile not just who I was biologically, but also who I had become as a result of decades of systematic psychological manipulation. The process of reconstructing my identity after discovering the truth was like trying to assemble a puzzle with pieces that had been deliberately deformed to never fit perfectly. Every childhood memory needed to be re-examined through the new lens of understanding that Regina had consciously planted doubts and insecurities where she should have nurtured confidence and belonging. Family photographs that I had obsessively studied looking for signs of physical difference now revealed obvious similarities that had been denied and distorted through constant gaslighting. The same eye shape, the same facial structure, even identical mannerisms that Regina had trained me not to recognize through constant and cruel comparisons with imaginary characteristics of fictional biological parents. The realization that I had wasted 20 years of my life searching for ghosts while the truth was literally before my eyes all along created an anger so intense it sometimes made me physically sick. The legal and ethical implications of what Regina had done began to become clear when I consulted lawyers about possible actions for psychological abuse and moral damages. Although the statute of limitations complicated any formal proceedings, the legal consultations helped me understand the criminal gravity of what had been perpetrated against me under the guise of maternal education. One of the lawyers, specializing in family abuse and psychological manipulation cases, explained that what Regina had done constituted a particularly cruel form of psychological torture that could have resulted in criminal proceedings if it had been properly documented at the time. This legal validation of the severity of the abuse was surprisingly therapeutic, confirming that my anger and trauma were completely justified responses to genuine crimes committed against my mental health, not dramatic exaggerations of an ungrateful daughter, as Regina frequently suggested to minimize her actions. The impact of the revelation extended far beyond my relationship with Regina, profoundly affecting my connection with Marcos and other family members who had been silent accomplices or active participants in maintaining the lie. The realization that my father had watched passively while Regina systematically destroyed my self-esteem with lies about adoption transformed any remnant of filial respect into bitter contempt for his cowardice. During a painful but necessary conversation, Marcos finally admitted he had tried several times to convince Regina to tell the truth, but had given up in the face of her threats of divorce and making his life an even worse hell. His admission of weakness only confirmed what I had always suspected, that he had chosen his own comfort and stability over his daughter's psychological well-being, becoming an accomplice through omission in emotional crimes that would leave permanent marks. During the process of confronting Isabel about the memories of my birth, I discovered through old hospital documents she had secretly kept that Regina had experienced severe psychiatric complications during the postpartum period, developing a postpartum psychosis that required involuntary hospitalization for 3 months when I was only 2 weeks old. The medical records detailed delusional episodes where Regina firmly believed they had switched her real baby at the hospital for a strange child, a paranoid fixation that psychiatrists at the time treated with heavy medication and intensive therapy, until she apparently regained contact with reality and could resume maternal care under strict family supervision. Isabel revealed with tears in her eyes that the entire family had made a pact of silence about that dark period, naively believing that protecting Regina from the social embarrassment of having been institutionalized in a psychiatric facility was more important than monitoring possible long-term psychological sequelae that could affect her capacity to exercise healthy motherhood. The discovery of these medical documents completely transformed my understanding of the nature of Regina's manipulation, revealing layers of psychiatric complexity I had never considered during the 2 decades of emotional torment I suffered, believing I was adopted. The reports described in cold clinical language how Regina had developed an elaborate conspiracy theory during her initial psychosis about hospital nurses who supposedly participated in an international baby trafficking scheme, switching children from wealthy families with orphans who would be raised with privileges while the real babies were sold for illegal adoption abroad. Even after hospital discharge and apparent recovery, psychiatrists had warned about the possibility of residual ideations that could resurface during moments of extreme emotional stress, recommending continued psychiatric follow-up that Marcos and the family decided to ignore once Regina demonstrated the ability to function socially without obvious manifestations of delusion. Dr. Mendez, a psychiatrist specializing in psychotic disorders and intergenerational trauma, whom I sought after these devastating revelations, spent hours analyzing the old medical documents with me and explaining how untreated postpartum psychosis could have evolved into a more subtle but equally destructive persistent delusional disorder. He described with frightening scientific precision how Regina could have maintained a partially encapsulated delusional belief about my identity for decades, a pathological conviction that coexisted with her ability to function apparently normally in other areas of life, manifesting only through cruel comments about imaginary physical differences and constant insinuations about not belonging that she genuinely believed were true at some deep level of her fragmented psyche. The psychiatric explanation didn't diminish the damage caused, but added a tragic dimension to the story of a woman who had transformed her own untreated mental illness into a weapon of psychological torture against the daughter who, ironically, she may have genuinely believed wasn't hers during dissociative episodes. Marcos, when finally confronted with the medical documents Isabel had preserved, completely broke his facade of neutrality and revealed decades of repressed guilt about his decision to minimize the severity of Regina's mental illness to preserve the family image. He confessed through sobs that he had witnessed multiple episodes over the years where Regina entered dissociative states and spoke about me as if I were a stranger living in her house, moments he chose to ignore or rationalize as harmless eccentricities instead of clear signs of unresolved psychopathology. His cowardice wasn't just passivity in the face of emotional abuse, but active negligence in seeking adequate psychiatric treatment for a wife who clearly suffered from serious mental disorders. Prioritizing the maintenance of social appearances over the mental health of the entire family, especially mine as the primary target of Regina's delusional ideations. During a particularly intense session with Dr. Mendez, we explored the terrifying possibility that Regina might have genuinely believed her own lies about my adoption during the most severe episodes of dissociation, creating an alternative reality in her mind where she was heroically raising an orphaned child instead of psychologically torturing her own biological daughter. This complex psychiatric interpretation didn't absolve Regina of moral or legal responsibility for the damages caused, but suggested that her cruelty might have been fueled by genuine psychosis instead of pure sadism, a distinction that made the entire situation even more tragically absurd. Dr. Mendez emphasized that mental disorders never justify child abuse, but understanding the psychodynamics behind abusive behavior was essential for my own healing process and to prevent the perpetuation of intergenerational traumatic patterns. The deeper investigation into the family psychiatric history revealed that Regina's maternal grandmother had been permanently institutionalized in a sanatorium after developing what at the time was diagnosed as severe maternal hysteria, but was probably schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The fragmented records I managed to access through old hospital archives described a woman who believed her children had been replaced by changelings, mystical creatures from folklore that took the place of human children, a delusional belief frighteningly similar to Regina's conviction about my supposed adopted condition. The revelation of a possible genetic predisposition to psychotic disorders with specific themes of child substitution added a sinister hereditary dimension to the family tragedy, suggesting that Regina might have inherited not just biological vulnerability to psychosis, but also the specific content of her delusional ideations. Isabel revealed during our subsequent conversations that Regina had shown worrying signs of mental instability even before my conception, including episodes of paranoia about neighbors supposedly watching her, elaborate theories about secret messages in television programs, and periods of depersonalization, where she claimed to feel like an actress playing the role of herself. The family had systematically minimized these behaviors as female nervousness or overactive imagination, refusing to recognize the obvious symptoms of an emerging psychotic disorder that could have been effectively treated with early psychiatric intervention. The collective family denial about mental illness, fueled by social stigma and fear of scandal, had created the perfect environment for Regina's psychopathology to flourish unchecked, eventually transforming me into the primary target of her delusional projections. Confronting these revelations about Regina's mental health forced me to completely reconsider 20 years of traumatic memories through a new psychiatric lens that didn't diminish my suffering, but recontextualized it in deeply disturbing ways. Each cruel comment about my physical appearance could have been a manifestation of subtle visual hallucinations, where Regina literally saw me as different from what I was. Each insinuation about not belonging could have been an expression of genuine delusional conviction instead of calculated manipulation. Each episode of emotional cruelty could have been fueled by hallucinatory voices that confirmed her paranoid suspicions about my identity. The possibility that I had been psychologically tortured by someone who was genuinely psychotic during much of my childhood and adolescence created a completely different type of trauma. The horror of having been raised by someone whose contact with reality was fundamentally compromised. Laura, my therapist, needed to completely adapt our therapeutic approach after these revelations, incorporating specialized techniques for dealing with trauma caused by caregivers with serious mental illnesses. She helped me process the complex anger I felt, not just for the psychological torture I suffered, but for the systematic negligence of an entire family that allowed a seriously ill woman to raise a child without supervision or adequate treatment. The therapeutic process became even more challenging because I needed to simultaneously process the trauma of abuse and the disturbing realization that my abuser might not have been fully conscious or in control of her actions during psychotic episodes. Laura constantly emphasized that understanding Regina's mental illness didn't mean forgiving her or minimizing the damage caused, but rather developing a more complex and nuanced narrative about my life story. The discovery that other family members knew about Regina's psychiatric history but chose to maintain silence transformed my individual anger against her into systemic fury against the entire family structure that had failed to protect me. Uncles and aunts I had considered harmless peripheral figures were now revealed as active accomplices in a conspiracy of silence that prioritized family reputation over my psychological well-being. Every family gathering where they witnessed Regina's humiliations and cruelties without intervening now gained new meaning. They weren't just passive observers of emotional abuse, but conscious participants in collective negligence that allowed a mentally ill woman to systematically destroy a child's self-esteem. The betrayal wasn't just Regina's, but of an entire sick family system that chose to protect secrets instead of protecting a child. During the process of investigating the family's psychiatric history, I discovered through medical records that Regina had attempted suicide twice during my childhood, episodes that were carefully hidden from me and presented as hospitalizations for exhaustion or health retreats. The chosen methods, overdose of psychiatric medications she should have been taking regularly, suggested both deep despair and resistance to treatment that could have stabilized her condition. The dates of these attempts coincided with periods I remembered as particularly cruel in terms of psychological abuse, suggesting a disturbing correlation between the deterioration of Regina's mental health and the intensification of her delusional projections about my identity. The realization that I had been raised by someone actively suicidal who simultaneously tortured me psychologically created an emotional paradox almost impossible to process. How to reconcile justified hatred for abuse with human compassion for someone in extreme mental suffering? Marcos finally revealed that Regina had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder 5 years before the revelation about my supposed adoption, but had refused consistent treatment, taking antipsychotic medication only sporadically when symptoms became impossible to hide socially. He admitted to having forged signatures on medical prescriptions to maintain a supply of medications at home that he occasionally dissolved in Regina's drinks when she entered particularly agitated states, a pathetic and inadequate attempt to manage a serious psychiatric condition without proper medical supervision. The revelation that my father had essentially tried to secretly medicate my psychotic mother, instead of seeking hospitalization or compulsory treatment when necessary, demonstrated a level of negligence and incompetence that transformed him from passive accomplice to active facilitator of the abuse I suffered. Dr. Mendez organized a mediated family meeting where all relatives who had known about Regina's condition were confronted with the consequences of their choices to maintain silence. The session was devastatingly revealing, with each family member trying to justify their inaction through excuses ranging from, "We didn't want to intrude," to, "We thought it was better to keep the family together." Aunt Isabel was the only one who showed genuine remorse, admitting that fear of confronting Regina or being excluded from the family had outweighed her concern for my well-being, a moral cowardice she now recognized as unforgivable. The others maintained their defensive rationalizations, unable or unwilling to accept that their collective negligence had been a form of abuse by omission that had exponentially amplified the trauma caused by Regina's untreated mental illness. The investigation into the school years revealed that multiple teachers and counselors had expressed concerns about my emotional well-being and had tried to intervene, only to be blocked by Regina, who convinced them I was a difficult and lying child who invented stories for attention. School records contained disturbing notes about my erratic behavior, oscillating between desperate attempts at perfection to gain approval and episodes of explosive rage that I now understood as normal responses to constant psychological gaslighting. A particularly persistent teacher had even made a formal complaint to Child Protective Services, but the investigation was closed after Regina and Marcos presented a convincing facade of a model family during the home visit, aided by relatives who corroborated the narrative that I was a problematic child with fantasizing tendencies. Understanding that the entire system, family, educational, medical, and social, had failed to protect me from a severely mentally ill mother created a type of secondary trauma that was almost as devastating as the original abuse. It wasn't just Regina who had betrayed me, but an entire society that preferred to maintain the illusion of family normalcy instead of intervening to protect a child obviously in distress. Every adult who witnessed obvious signs of abuse and chose not to act, every professional who accepted Regina's explanations instead of investigating more deeply, every relative who prioritized superficial family harmony over my well-being, all were accomplices in a tragedy that could have been prevented with a single brave person willing to break the silence. During the process of reviewing family medical records, I discovered that Regina had been prescribed a specific combination of antipsychotics and mood stabilizers that, when taken consistently, had shown significant effectiveness in controlling her symptoms during brief periods of treatment adherence. The periods of relative mental stability coincided precisely with the rare positive memories I had from my childhood, fleeting moments where Regina seemed genuinely maternal and loving, only to dramatically reverse when she invariably abandoned the medication believing she was cured, or developing paranoia about doctors trying to control her through drugs. These cycles of stability and decompensation had created a pattern of intermittent abuse that was particularly damaging psychologically, never allowing me to develop a consistent narrative about who my mother really was or predict when the next episode of cruelty would come. Laura helped me process the devastating realization that the few positive memories I had with Regina, the rare moments of genuine maternal connection I had desperately guarded as evidence that she loved me despite everything, were probably the result of brain chemistry temporarily balanced by medication, instead of authentic maternal love emerging through the illness. This understanding destroyed even the crumbs of affection I had used to sustain some hope that, deep down, Regina cared about me. The truth was possibly even crueler. The loving mother who occasionally emerged was a pharmacological creation, while the cruel and delusional Regina was her true nature when left untreated. Or perhaps even more tragically, the true Regina was someone I had never known, lost decades ago in untreated psychosis that had consumed her original personality. The process of understanding the depth of Regina's mental illness also forced me to examine my own mental health with new urgency and anxiety. The genetic predisposition to psychotic disorders that clearly ran in the maternal family lineage created a constant terror that I might eventually develop similar symptoms. Every moment of extreme stress where I questioned my perception of reality, every episode of depersonalization during panic attacks, every instance where I wondered if I was interpreting social situations correctly, everything now carried the additional weight of fear of developing the same condition that had destroyed Regina's mind. Dr. Mendez assured me that my maintained insight and active pursuit of treatment were positive signs that differentiated my situation, but the fear remained as a constant shadow over my recovery. The decision to share these discoveries about Regina's mental health with other younger family members, particularly cousins who had witnessed the abuse but never understood its nature, became a personal mission to break the cycle of silence that had allowed trauma to perpetuate. I organized informational meetings where I shared the medical documentation and explained how stigma about mental illness had created the conditions for abuse to happen without intervention. Some cousins revealed their own experiences of strange or abusive behavior from Regina that now made sense in the context of her psychosis, while others expressed anger at having been kept ignorant about information that could have contextualized confusing and traumatic family dynamics. The process of family education about mental health became a form of personal activism, trying to ensure that future generations wouldn't suffer due to the same toxic silence. Confronting the mental health system that had failed Regina and, by extension, failed me, became another aspect of my process of seeking justice and understanding. I discovered through investigation that the hospital where Regina had been initially treated for postpartum psychosis had been closed for systematic negligence years later, with multiple patients suffering due to undertreatment and premature discharge. The psychiatrist who had signed her discharge had subsequently lost his medical license for malpractice in similar cases where he minimized the severity of psychotic conditions and released patients without adequate follow-up arrangements. These revelations confirmed that the failure to adequately treat Regina hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of institutional negligence that had destroyed countless lives. During a visit to the abandoned hospital archive, which had been partially preserved for legal investigations, I found the original nursing notes from the first days after my birth. The detailed descriptions of Regina's behavior were chilling. She had spent hours looking at me with suspicion, refusing to breastfeed for fear I might steal her essence, and repeatedly asking nurses to confirm I was really her baby through DNA tests that weren't available at the time. A particularly observant nurse had noted that Regina seemed to develop an elaborate narrative about how to identify the real baby through secret signs only she could perceive. A delusional ideation that apparently was never completely resolved despite the superficial treatment she received. The most disturbing discovery came through a diary Regina had kept during her hospitalization periods, hidden among old belongings in the attic. The pages revealed the terrifying depth of her delusional ideations, describing in vivid detail how she believed I had been exchanged for a fairy child who had been trained to perfectly imitate a human baby, but would reveal its supernatural true nature as it grew. She had developed an elaborate system of tests she would secretly apply over the years to confirm her suspicions, observing if my eyes glowed unnaturally in certain lights, if my laugh sounded authentic enough, if my childhood drawings contained hidden symbols that would reveal my non-human origin. The realization that my entire childhood had been a laboratory for Regina's psychotic theories about my identity was devastatingly dehumanizing. The diary also revealed that Regina had contemplated killing me multiple times during particularly severe psychotic episodes, believing this could break the spell and bring her real baby back. She described in disturbing detail how she had stood over my crib with a pillow, only to be stopped by hallucinatory voices that warned her that killing me would only complete the substitution permanently. Other entries described elaborate fantasies about abandoning me in public places, hoping my true supernatural parents would come get me, or about performing extreme religious rituals that could reverse the supposed exchange. The fact that I had survived childhood under the care of someone who actively contemplated infanticide as a solution to her delusional ideations was a disturbing miracle that left me physically nauseous. Sharing these discoveries with Laura during our therapy sessions often resulted in prolonged silences, while we both processed the gravity of what I had survived. She helped me understand that my resilience wasn't just psychological, but literal physical survival in the face of a psychotic caregiver who had considered eliminating me multiple times. The trauma wasn't just emotional and mental, but existential. The constant threat, even if not consciously perceived at the time, of physical annihilation by someone who should have been my most fundamental protector. Laura worked with me to process the retroactive terror of understanding how close I had been to death, during moments I remembered only as episodes of strange or distant maternal behavior. The investigation into the years after my adolescence revealed that Regina had been secretly hospitalized 3 more times during my teenage years and early adulthood, always during periods the family had explained as health spa trips or spiritual retreats. The records of these hospitalizations showed a disturbing progression of her psychosis, with ideations about my identity becoming increasingly elaborate and bizarre. During a particularly severe hospitalization when I was 15, she had tried to hire a private investigator to prove I was part of a government conspiracy of child replacement, convinced she had discovered patterns in birth certificates that revealed a massive baby switching operation. The investigator, recognizing obvious signs of mental illness, had alerted Marcos instead of taking the case. But again, no significant action was taken to protect me or treat Regina adequately. The pattern of intermittent hospitalizations and premature discharges had created a vicious cycle where Regina would temporarily improve enough to convince doctors she was stable, only to rapidly deteriorate once home without supervision or consistent medication. Each cycle deepened her delusional ideations about me. adding new layers of conspiratorial complexity that made it increasingly difficult for her to distinguish between her psychotic fantasies and reality. The doctors who treated her during these hospitalizations had repeatedly recommended long-term care or at least intensive outpatient psychiatric supervision. But Marcos and the family always opted for the alternative that would best preserve social appearances, effectively sacrificing any chance of Regina's real recovery and ensuring the continuation of my suffering. The process of understanding the hereditary dimension of Regina's mental illness led me to obsessively investigate 3 generations of maternal family medical archives, discovering a disturbing pattern of women who developed psychoses specifically related to motherhood and children's identity. Regina's great-grandmother had spent the last 20 years of her life in a psychiatric institution, after trying to drown her youngest daughter in a psychotic episode where she believed the child had been replaced by a demon in disguise, a delusion that doctors at the time treated with lobotomy and electroshock without significant success. The fragmented records described a woman who developed an elaborate system of identifying marks only she could see in her children, invisible signs that supposedly revealed their supernatural or alien nature, a delusional methodology frighteningly similar to the tests Regina had secretly applied to me throughout my childhood. The discovery that I was part of a lineage of mentally disturbed women created a new type of existential terror about my own reproductive future and mental health. During intense sessions with Dr. Mendez, we explored the genetic and epigenetic implications of carrying this hereditary predisposition, discussing statistical probabilities of developing similar symptoms and preventive strategies that could minimize risks. He explained that the consistent manifestation of psychoses with specific themes of child substitution across generations suggested not just general genetic vulnerability to mental disorders, but possibly a specific mutation that predisposed to this particular type of delusion. A cursed inheritance I carried in my DNA like a biological time bomb waiting for the right conditions to detonate. Isabel revealed during our deeper conversations that she had witnessed multiple psychotic episodes of Regina during my childhood that were systematically covered up by the family through convenient explanations and elaborate lies. She described a particularly disturbing occasion when I was 4 years old, where Regina had spent an entire night performing what she called a verification ritual, obsessively measuring parts of my body with a measuring tape and comparing with secret notes she kept about normal versus abnormal proportions that would indicate my supposed non-human nature. Isabel had found Regina at 3 a.m. in my room, whispering strange incantations while passing her hands over my sleeping body, searching for birthmarks that would appear under moonlight, that would confirm her delusional suspicions about my identity. Confronting these accounts forced me to re-examine childhood memories through an even more disturbing lens, recognizing behaviors I had normalized as maternal eccentricities, but were clearly manifestations of active psychosis. I remembered how Regina frequently woke me in the middle of the night to check if my eyes still maintained the right color, how she obsessively collected locks of my hair in dated envelopes to compare subtle texture changes that could reveal my gradual transformation, how she secretly recorded my voice at different ages to analyze modulations that would indicate when my original programming would begin to fail. Each recovered memory added an additional layer of retroactive horror to the understanding that I had been raised as a study object for the psychotic theories of someone who should have protected me. During the family investigation process, I discovered that Regina had maintained secret correspondence with an online group of people who shared similar beliefs about substituted children, a community of clearly psychotic individuals who mutually validated their delusional ideations through elaborate conspiracy theories about secret government baby exchange programs. The emails I found on an old computer were disturbingly detailed, with Regina describing my physical and behavioral characteristics to other group members who offered specialized analyses about signs that would confirm my non-human nature. She had even shared photographs of me without my knowledge, asking for opinions about imaginary physical anomalies that only people with special vision could identify. The most devastating revelation came through a video Regina had secretly recorded when I was 12 years old, where she conducted what she called the definitive test while I slept deeply. In the video, she whispered to the camera her theories about how substituted children revealed their true nature during REM sleep, when their conscious defenses were deactivated. She filmed my sleeping face for hours, zooming in on minimal details like eye movement under the eyelids, breathing patterns, and facial micro-expressions she interpreted as evidence of communication with alien controllers or original supernatural parents. The violation of my privacy and dignity during moments of absolute vulnerability created a type of trauma that transcended conventional psychological categories. Laura helped me process the complex anger that arose from these discoveries, a fury directed not just against Regina, but against an entire system of negligence that had allowed a severely psychotic woman unrestricted access to a vulnerable child. Therapy became a space to explore the implications of having been essentially raised as an involuntary guinea pig for someone's psychotic experiments, who operated under elaborate delusions about my identity. We processed the impact of having every aspect of my existence, from physical characteristics to sleep patterns, scrutinized through a delusional lens that fundamentally dehumanized me, transforming me from person to object of paranoid investigation. The legal process of seeking additional compensation for psychological damages became complicated when we discovered that Regina had been posthumously diagnosed through analysis of medical records with a rare form of somatic delusional disorder, where she genuinely experienced tactile and visual hallucinations that confirmed her beliefs about my identity. Neurologists consulted suggested she might have suffered from an undiagnosed organic brain condition that amplified genetic predispositions to psychosis, possibly a tumor or degeneration in specific brain areas, responsible for facial recognition and identity processing. This possibility added layers of medical and ethical complexity to the question of criminal responsibility versus mental incapacity. The investigation into the years when Regina worked as a primary school teacher before my birth revealed documented concerns about her behavior with certain children she identified as different or special in ways only she could perceive. School records indicated she had been discreetly removed from direct teaching after multiple parent complaints about disturbing comments she made about their children, suggesting some weren't truly their parents' biological children, or had been switched at some point. The school administration had covered up the situation by transferring her to administrative functions to avoid scandal, effectively allowing a woman with clear signs of psychosis to continue having access to vulnerable children in reduced capacity. During a visit to the municipal archive, I discovered that Regina had been discreetly investigated by Child Protective Services when I was 6 years old, following an anonymous report about strange and potentially abusive behavior. The investigation report, which had been filed without action after a superficial home visit, contained disturbing observations from the investigator about Regina's peculiar but not immediately dangerous behavior, including her insistence on showing evidence that I was different from other children through obsessive body measurements and collections of artifacts like baby teeth and locks of hair she kept meticulously cataloged. The investigator had concluded that although the behavior was eccentric, there was no evidence of physical abuse or neglect that would justify intervention. Understanding how many missed opportunities there had been for intervention created a secondary anger directed against professionals and institutions that prioritized avoiding confrontation over protecting a child from a clearly disturbed caregiver. Every person who noticed obvious signs of psychosis in Regina but chose not to act, teachers, doctors, social workers, family members, had contributed to decades of psychological abuse that could have been prevented with a single brave intervention. The collective silence, motivated by convenience, fear of legal action, or simple indifference, had created the perfect conditions for Regina's delusions to flourish unchecked, transforming my entire childhood into an unsupervised psychotic experiment. I discovered through a distant cousin that Regina had tried to test other young family members during family gatherings, applying subtle versions of her verification methods to cousins and nephews when parents weren't watching. She kept secret notes about each child in the extended family, classifying them into categories of authenticity based on delusional criteria that only made sense in her disturbed mind. Some cousins revealed memories of Regina making strange comments about their appearances or behaviors, suggesting they were different in ways she never fully explained, planting seeds of insecurity and confusion that some carried into adulthood. The intergenerational impact of Regina's psychotic behavior became evident when multiple family members began sharing their own experiences of disturbing interactions with her over the years. An aunt revealed she had forbidden Regina from being alone with her children after catching her performing strange tests that involved observing reactions to specific stimuli that supposedly would reveal non-human nature. An uncle admitted to cutting contact with Regina years before after she suggested his newborn son had wrong eyes to be truly his. Each revelation confirmed that Regina's delusions weren't limited to me, but represented a broader pattern of psychotic behavior that had impacted multiple lives in ways that were only now being recognized. Laura helped me process the complex guilt that arose from discovering that others had suffered due to Regina's delusions while I had been the primary focus. We explored the psychological phenomenon of inverted survivor's guilt, where I felt responsible for having inadvertently protected others by absorbing most of Regina's psychotic attention. Therapy focused on recognizing that I had been a powerless child who had no capacity or responsibility to protect others, and that my psychological survival was a remarkable achievement, considering the intensity and duration of the abuse I suffered. The process of systematically documenting all instances of Regina's psychotic behavior became simultaneously therapeutic and re-traumatizing, forcing me to confront the full extent of a childhood that had been fundamentally shaped by untreated mental illness. I created a detailed timeline correlating her psychiatric hospitalizations with periods of particularly intense abuse, identifying patterns of deterioration and partial recovery that had created a chaotically unpredictable home environment. The documentation revealed that the periods of normalcy I so valued were actually brief intervals between active psychotic episodes. Fleeting moments where medication temporarily suppressed her delusions only for them to return with amplified intensity when she invariably stopped treatment. During this documentation process, I discovered that Regina had spent significant amounts of family money on research about substituted children, including consultations with charlatans who presented themselves as experts in detecting non-human nature, books about conspiracy theories related to secret government programs, and even pseudoscientific equipment that supposedly detected abnormal energy frequencies I would emit. Marcos had allowed these expenses to keep the peace, effectively funding and validating Regina's delusions instead of insisting on adequate psychiatric treatment. The financial negligence added to the emotional and medical negligence, creating a complete picture of systemic family failure. The decision to write and anonymously publish my story in support forums for adults who grew up with psychotic parents became a form of therapeutic activism. The responses I received revealed a global community of survivors who had experienced similar traumas, many raised by caregivers suffering from specific delusions about their children's identity or nature. We shared recovery strategies, legal resources for seeking justice or compensation, and especially mutual validation of experiences that the outside world often considered too fantastic to be true. The connection with other survivors provided a type of healing that individual therapy couldn't completely achieve. The process of reconstructing my identity after decades of psychotic gaslighting required not just traditional therapy, but also creative exploration through art and writing. I began creating a series of self-portraits that visually documented my journey from dehumanized object of psychotic scrutiny to complete person with agency and identity. Each artwork represented a different aspect of trauma and recovery, some showing the fragmentation caused by years of having my reality constantly questioned, others celebrating the gradual integration of a coherent identity, free from doubts imposed by others' delusions. Art became a language to express experiences that transcended conventional words. The decision to submit Regina's case for academic study at psychiatry and psychology conferences, maintaining anonymity through pseudonyms, contributed to advances in understanding how parental delusional disorders impact child development. Researchers identified specific trauma patterns in children raised by caregivers with delusions about child identity, developing specialized treatment protocols for adult survivors. My case became a reference in discussions about the need for early intervention when parents show signs of psychosis, regardless of evidence of traditional physical abuse. The decision to confront Regina one last time before her death, which occurred 3 years after our last conversation when she developed aggressive cancer while serving her compulsory psychiatric sentence, represented the definitive closure of a trauma cycle that had defined 4 decades of my existence. The call from the penitentiary psychiatric hospital informing me about her terminal state and her desperate request to see me created a devastating internal conflict between the human need to provide some kind of peace to a dying woman and the psychological self-preservation I had fought so hard to achieve. Laura and I spent weeks exploring the implications of accepting or refusing this final meeting, weighing the potential for emotional closure against the risk of re-traumatization from confronting again the primary source of my psychological suffering, even in her vulnerable state of physical and mental deterioration. The visit to the psychiatric hospital where Regina spent her last days was a surreal experience that forced me to simultaneously confront the woman who had psychologically tortured me and the fragile human shell the disease had left. She was unrecognizable, her body devastated by the combination of advanced cancer and decades of heavy psychiatric medication, her blue eyes that once gleamed with delusional paranoia, now opaque and distant, occasionally showing glimpses of lucidity between periods of medicated confusion. The doctors had explained that the brain tumor that had contributed to her delusions over the years had ironically destroyed the same areas that generated her paranoid ideations, leaving her in a state of partial mental clarity she had never experienced during my life. A cruel medical irony that made our final conversation possible only because the disease had temporarily suppressed the mental illness. During those final 2 hours together, Regina oscillated between moments of disturbing lucidity where she seemed to understand for the first time the magnitude of suffering she had caused, and periods of confusion where she called me by names of people who existed only in her hallucinations. In the clear moments, she tried to explain through words broken by pain and medication how she had genuinely believed I was an imposter during most of my life, describing visual hallucinations where my face transformed into something monstrous when she looked directly at me, voices that constantly whispered I was a disguised threat, tactile sensations where my skin felt wrong when she touched me. Her attempt to explain the subjective experience of her psychosis didn't absolve the crimes committed, but provided a disturbing window into an internal world where reality was fundamentally distorted in ways that sane people could never fully understand. The most impactful moment of that final visit occurred when Regina, in a rare moment of complete clarity enhanced by the proximity of death, looked directly into my eyes and said with a weak but clear voice that she could finally see me as I really was for the first time in decades. She described with genuine amazement how my face had suddenly become real to her in recent weeks, as if a veil had been lifted revealing the daughter who had always been there, but whom her sick mind had never been able to perceive. Her tears as she touched my face with trembling fingers and repeated my name as if learning it for the first time created a moment of genuine human connection that transcended decades of trauma, not erasing the past, but offering a painful glimpse of the relationship that could have existed if mental illness hadn't fundamentally distorted her perception of reality. Regina's final confession about the years of psychological torture revealed additional layers of complexity about her subjective experience that complicated simplistic narratives of victim and aggressor. She admitted that even during periods of greatest cruelty, a small, suppressed part of her consciousness knew she was doing something terribly wrong. But the voices and hallucinations were so convincing and persistent that she couldn't resist their demands to constantly test my authenticity. She described the experience as being trapped inside her own mind while something alien controlled her actions, aware of the damage she caused but powerless to stop. A description that corresponded to clinical accounts of people with severe psychotic disorders who maintained some level of insight during acute episodes. This revelation didn't diminish my anger or trauma, but added an additional tragic dimension to the understanding that we had both been victims of a devastating mental illness that had destroyed any possibility of a normal maternal relationship. Laura helped me process the implications of this final conversation during months of intensive therapy that followed, exploring how Regina's belated validation of my real identity paradoxically reopened wounds I thought were healing. The confirmation that she finally saw me as her true daughter should have brought some kind of peace or resolution, but instead amplified the tragedy of decades lost to delusions that could have been treated with adequate psychiatric intervention. We processed the renewed anger against the family and medical system that had failed to protect both me and, in a way, Regina herself, from a devastating mental illness that had destroyed any chance of a functional relationship. Therapy focused on accepting that multiple truths could coexist. Regina had been both a perpetrator of horrible abuse and a victim of severe untreated mental illness, and I could feel both justified anger and human compassion without one emotion invalidating the other. Regina's death 2 weeks after our final conversation was simultaneously anticlimactic and profoundly significant in ways I hadn't anticipated. I received the news through an impersonal hospital call while I was at work, and my first reaction was an emotional void that scared me more than any explosion of feelings would have. There were no tears, no relief, no immediate sadness, just a strange sense of disorientation, as if a weight I had carried for so long had been suddenly removed and I didn't know how to exist without its oppressive presence. Regina's absence from the world created a vacuum where decades of anger and trauma no longer had a direct target, forcing me to confront the fact that much of my adult identity had been built in opposition to her. And now I needed to discover who I was without that negative reference point. The decision to attend Regina's funeral, held in a small, discreet ceremony due to the stigma of mental illness and the circumstances of her institutionalization, was made after long discussions with Laura about what would be psychologically healthiest for my closure process. I attended not as a grieving daughter seeking comfort, but as a survivor witnessing the definitive end of a traumatic chapter. Dressed in gray instead of black, to symbolize the ambiguity of my feelings. The few family members present maintained a respectful distance, implicitly understanding that my presence was about my own healing process and not about honoring Regina or comforting others. Marcos, visibly aged and broken by accumulated guilt, tried to approach for a conversation, but I maintained firm boundaries, not ready to process his role as a passive facilitator, while still dealing with the death of the primary perpetrator. During the ceremony, while observing the closed coffin containing the body of the woman who had been simultaneously my mother and my torturer, I experienced a disturbing epiphany about the nature of identity and family relationships. Regina had spent decades obsessed with my supposed falseness, while it was she who had been fundamentally false, not by choice or malice, but because her sick mind had created a distorted version of me that never existed except in her hallucinations. The true tragedy wasn't just the abuse I suffered, but the fact that Regina had never really known her own daughter, wasting an entire lifetime at war against a ghost her psychosis had conjured. This understanding didn't absolve her crimes, but recontextualized our entire relationship as a tragedy of lost identities. She to mental illness, I to the resulting trauma. The process of dealing with Regina's estate revealed additional disturbing aspects about the depth of her delusional obsessions. Among her personal belongings at the hospital, I found notebooks filled with decades of meticulous observations about my behavior, disturbing drawings of how she perceived me during psychotic episodes, and never sent letters addressed to my supposed true parents begging them to come get me. A particularly disturbing notebook contained what she called definitive evidence of my non-human nature, photographs of me at different ages with paranoid annotations about supposed physical anomalies circled in red, transcripts of normal conversations she interpreted as secret codes, even numerological analyses of my name that supposedly revealed hidden messages about my alien origin. The extent of the documentation demonstrated that her entire life had been consumed by these delusions, transforming motherhood into an obsessive, paranoid investigation. The most devastating discovery was a series of letters Regina had written to me during her last months of life, when the mental clarity provided by tumor destruction of certain brain areas had allowed moments of understanding about what she had done. The letters, written with trembling and sometimes incoherent handwriting due to medication and disease progression, were desperate attempts to explain the inexplicable, to ask forgiveness for the unforgivable, to express a maternal love that had been distorted and weaponized by mental illness, but which she claimed had always existed beneath the layers of psychosis. She described specific moments of cruelty that now haunted her, recognizing the terror she must have caused an innocent child, admitting that even her loving memories had been contaminated by constant paranoia about my identity. Laura helped me process these letters during extraordinarily difficult sessions, where I oscillated between anger at posthumous manipulation and painful recognition that Regina had finally achieved insight into her acts when it was too late to repair any damage. We explored how these belated attempts at reconciliation complicated my grieving process, creating additional layers of emotional ambiguity where I simultaneously mourned the mother I never had, the relationship that could have been, and even, disturbingly, the sick woman who had died alone and tormented by belated understanding of the crimes she had committed. The grief wasn't clean or linear, but a fragmented experience that reflected the fragmented nature of our dysfunctional relationship. The months following Regina's death were marked by a fundamental reconstruction of my identity, without the oppressive presence that had defined so much of my adult life. I discovered that much of my personality had been formed in reaction to her abuses. My obsessive need to document everything came from constant gaslighting. My difficulty trusting my own perceptions resulted from decades of having reality questioned. My perfectionism was an attempt to prove worth to someone who would never see me as enough. Without Regina to react against, I needed to discover who I was authentically. Which aspects of my personality were genuinely mine versus defense mechanisms developed to survive psychological abuse. This process of self-discovery was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like learning to walk again after decades using crutches I didn't know were unnecessary. The decision to forgive Regina, made after 2 years of intensely processing her death and legacy, wasn't about absolving her crimes or minimizing my trauma, but about freeing myself from the weight of carrying hatred for someone who no longer existed. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing, but rather accepting that Regina had been a deeply ill woman who had caused immeasurable damage while fighting internal demons she never managed to defeat. Laura helped me understand that forgiving wasn't betrayal of the child who had suffered, but rather an act of self-compassion that recognized carrying eternal anger only perpetuated my own suffering. Forgiveness was a gradual and non-linear process, with moments of relapse where anger resurged with renewed intensity. But eventually I reached a state of acceptance where I could hold memories of trauma without being consumed by them. The impact of my story on professional understanding of childhood trauma caused by psychotic caregivers led to the development of new treatment protocols that were implemented in specialized clinics. My case became a fundamental study on the long-term effects of being raised by someone with delusional disorder focused on the child's identity, contributing to changes in how mental health professionals approach similar situations. I participated anonymously in conferences where my experience was presented as evidence of the need for early and aggressive intervention when parents show signs of psychosis. Regardless of the absence of traditional physical abuse, the academic and clinical validation of the severity of my trauma was deeply healing, confirming that my suffering had been real and significant, not dramatization or exaggeration, as Regina and others had suggested for years. Creating a foundation dedicated to supporting children and adult survivors of psychological abuse by mentally ill caregivers became my way of transforming personal trauma into positive social change. The foundation, ironically named True Identity Project, provides legal, therapeutic, and financial resources for people navigating similar situations, while also lobbying for legislative changes that facilitate intervention when children are at risk due to untreated parental mental illness. Through the foundation's work, I met hundreds of survivors with similar stories, each unique in its details but sharing common themes of gaslighting, reality manipulation, and the specific trauma of having one's identity constantly questioned by those who should provide security and validation. The relationship with Marcos after Regina's death remained permanently damaged, marked by his passive complicity in decades of abuse. Although he tried multiple times to establish some kind of connection, especially after developing his own health problems, I maintained firm boundaries that protected my hard-won emotional stability. His death 3 years after Regina was received with emotional indifference that some might consider cruel, but represented necessary self-preservation. I didn't attend his funeral, not out of active anger, but because he had chosen to be a non-factor in my life when I most needed protection, and I was simply returning that absence. Isabel, the only family member who had shown genuine remorse, maintained sporadic contact that I tolerated but didn't encourage, a compromise that acknowledged her belated attempt at accountability without granting complete forgiveness for decades of complicit silence. At 42, 5 years after Regina's death, I finally achieved a state of inner peace that had seemed impossible during most of my adult life. My identity was no longer defined in opposition to Regina's delusions or as a trauma survivor, but as a complete person with multiple stories that included but weren't dominated by the abuse suffered. I developed healthy relationships based on genuine mutual trust, no longer sabotaging connections out of fear of abandonment or betrayal. My career flourished when I stopped trying to prove worth through obsessive perfection, allowing creativity and vulnerability that paradoxically made me more successful. The ongoing therapeutic work with Laura evolved from trauma processing to personal growth, exploring who I wanted to be now that I was no longer reacting to past threats. The decision to have children, postponed for years due to terror of potentially transmitting genetic predisposition to mental illness or perpetuating trauma cycles, was made after extensive genetic counseling and psychological preparation. When my daughter was born, healthy and perfect, I simultaneously experienced profound joy and existential terror upon viscerally understanding a child's vulnerability and the overwhelming responsibility of not perpetuating the destructive patterns I had experienced. Each of her developmental milestones was simultaneously celebration and traumatic trigger, reminding me of corresponding moments from my childhood when Regina was conducting her paranoid tests. Laura helped me develop strategies to separate my maternal experience from Regina's shadow, creating new healthy patterns while remaining vigilant about my own mental health. The most profound moment of healing occurred when my daughter, at 4 years old, the same age when Isabel had witnessed Regina conducting verification rituals on me, looked at me with absolute trust and said she loved me. The pure simplicity of that moment, free from doubts, paranoia, or identity questioning, made me truly understand for the first time what had been stolen from me. I cried for hours after she fell asleep, not from sadness but from a complex combination of grief for what I never had and profound gratitude for being able to provide her what was denied to me. The ability to see my daughter clearly and completely as she was, without filters of mental illness or paranoia, was a gift Regina could never give me, and that I was determined never to take for granted. Publishing a memoir about my experience, after years of hesitation about public exposure, became the final act of reclaiming my narrative and identity. The book, titled Ghost Daughter Surviving Maternal Delusion, detailed not just the abuse suffered, but also the complex journey of healing and identity reconstruction. The reception was polarized. Some readers thanked me for validating similar experiences, while others criticized the exposure of family mental illness and questioned the ethics of publishing such an intimate story after Regina's death. I stood by my decision, recognizing that my story wasn't just mine, but part of a larger narrative about intergenerational trauma, untreated mental illness, and the possibility of healing even from the deepest wounds. The book became a valuable resource for mental health professionals and survivors, contributing to changes in how society understands and responds to situations of childhood psychological abuse by mentally ill caregivers. Today, at 45, I look back on the journey since that devastating afternoon when Regina first planted the poisonous seed of doubt about my identity, and recognize that I became someone she could never have imagined, not despite the trauma, but through the alchemy of transforming suffering into wisdom, pain into purpose, and fragmentation into integration. My identity is no longer a question or quest, but a certainty grounded not in external validation or documents, but in the deep knowledge of who I chose to become through each decision to survive, heal, and thrive. Regina may have tried to make me believe I was adopted to make me suffer, but she inadvertently taught me the most valuable lesson about identity, that it's not determined by blood, genes, or even others' perception, but by the choices we make about who we want to be and how we choose to love, even when love was denied to us. The final irony is that, in a way, Regina was right. I was different. I didn't belong to the distorted world her sick mind had created. But that difference wasn't a defect or falseness. It was sanity amid madness, reality amid delusion, and ultimately, the capacity to transcend the limits of trauma she had tried to impose. My true identity emerged not despite her attempts to destroy it, but strengthened by the process of resisting, surviving, and eventually thriving beyond any destiny she had imagined for her imposter daughter. In the end, I discovered that the question was never whether I was really Regina's daughter, but rather what kind of person I would choose to be regardless of the answer. And that choice? To be someone capable of love, compassion, and healing even after profound trauma is the only identity that truly matters. Did you enjoy Helena's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.